My name is Nina Fundeller-Walden, and I'm the Managing Director of Chai Mitzvah, the Resource Center for Jewish Engagement. Chai Mitzvah, the sponsor of Scholars Circle, is a Jewish engagement program that partners with organizations and has worked with over 9,000 individuals in small group learning, social action, and spiritual and ritual development. The Scholars Circle hosts lectures by prominent scholars every 2 weeks on topics relating to Israel and the Jewish community, geared to rabbis, educators, and lay leaders who are charged with explaining the complex issues which the Jewish community is facing. To that end, each lecture will have a resource sheet that will be sent to you after the lecture. A recording of each lecture will be accessible on our website and shared with you through email. Our scholar tonight is Dr. Shale Horowitz, professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. His research has examined international and ethnic conflict, the politics of international trade and finance, and the politics of market transition and institutional change. He's the author, co-author, or co-editor of 5 books and over 50 academic articles. His current research interests include ethno-territorial wars and Chinese politics. Before I introduce Dr. Shale Horowitz, a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, to submit questions, please use the Q&A button on your screen. Q&A will be held at about 40 minutes into the lecture, but you can submit questions anytime throughout. Shortly after the lecture recording will be sent to your email and will also be available at chaimitzvah.org. Now I'm happy to introduce Dr. Shale Horowitz.
Thank you very much, Nina. Hey, thank you all so much for coming to listen. So this is a very hot topic now that the intense war has started with Hamas since October 7th. Israel is in the news, and Israel is usually attacked and condemned. So what this lecture is about how we should judge Israel. And the main argument is that Israel should not be judged relative to some kind of abstract or utopian standard of perfection in her conflicts. That's unreasonable and unfair, but rather she should be judged by comparison with the dozens of other countries that are involved in conflicts of the same type. So if we do that, if we judge Israel in that way, Israel is among the best in terms of her behavior, her moderation, her willingness to take steps to recognize the other side and to minimize the harm to the other side of all the countries involved in such conflicts. And under those circumstances, to attack Israel, to single Israel out, supposedly for being among the worst, is an inversion of reality and is part of the war that Israel's enemies are conducting to destroy her. So let's just repeat those main points in a little bit more detail now. So I'm going to talk more in a moment about what kind of criteria or standards we should use to judge states involved in these types of conflicts. And the most commonly used ones, which I'll be talking about, are what are their goals and methods, and what kind of threats do they face? So if we use these criteria, which I'll talk about more in a moment, Israel's goals and methods are among the most moderate, possibly the most moderate of all countries involved in such conflicts, even though Israel faces by far the greatest threat to her existence. I'll be talking about the fact that Israel's enemies are among the worst. So a second point here in view of this first point. So the most commonly accepted definition of anti-Semitism in the world is that of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is an international organization of 35 countries. And their definition of anti-Semitism includes these 2 elements: applying double standards toward Israel, which are not applied to other similar states in such conflicts, especially democratic states, and denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination when this right is extended to other people. So those are forms of hostile double standards. So if we look at the hostile double standards applied to Israel, they're not merely anti-Semitism. They're not merely things like negative stereotypes or conspiracy theories about the power of Jews. They're part of a larger conflict in which Israel's enemies aim to destroy Israel. And this is a genocidal campaign, right? It's not just destroying Israel, it is destroying her Jewish population as well. So singling out Israel for criticism is not just anti-Semitism, it is genocidal anti-Semitism. It's the worst possible form of anti-Semitism. So let's talk now about the types of conflicts that Israel is involved in more generally to allow us to compare Israel with other countries. So these conflicts are both ethnic and territorial at the same time, right? That is, they involve states or organizations which are attempting to achieve self-determination for their peoples. Usually their peoples are defined in ethnic terms. And the conflict is also territorial. That is, two sides claim the same territory as part of their ethnic homeland. So as you notice from the map at the very beginning, and we'll come back to that map a little bit later, this is an extremely common conflict. It occurs all over the world. And so we can compare Israel to many other countries. Now, again, the most important criteria that are used to compare are goals, methods, and threat levels. So goals and methods can be more or less moderate or more or less extreme. More extreme goals would be you do not recognize your enemy as having the same values or the same or deserving the same treatment as yourself. Rather, you seek to deny them that treatment. And in the most extreme case, you actually seek to destroy them. And on the other hand, more moderate goals involve pursuing your own goals of self-determination and self-defense in a way which recognizes that your enemies also have legitimate rights in those areas. What about methods? So, of course, if the methods you use are intended to achieve more extreme goals, those are more extreme methods. And the other factor, which is widely discussed, is in fighting your wars or your conflicts, do you attempt to minimize harm to civilians? That's more moderate. Or by contrast, do you actively target civilians and seek to destroy the civilian population of your enemy in varying degrees? Threat levels. How likely are you to be defeated in this conflict? And what are the consequences of military defeat in this conflict? So just to give you an example to illustrate the importance of that to you. So in World War II, Britain and the United States engaged in unlimited area bombing of enemy cities, of German and Japanese cities, for example. Why did they do this? Why did they fight the war in such a ferocious way when they did not usually fight wars in this way and have not usually since fought wars in this way? Because the consequences of enemy victory would be so horrific. That's why they did that. So the more dangerous your enemy is, the higher costs the cost is of showing moderation in your goals and your methods. So using these three criteria, we can compare Israel to other states involved in wars of this type. We can compare goals, methods, and threat levels. And we're going to do this in three ways. First, we're going to compare Israel to her enemies. Then we're going to compare Israel to Turkey, another regional state that has had similar conflicts. And then we're going to compare Israel more broadly to many other countries that have been involved in conflicts of this type. Okay, so let's start out with comparing Israel to her enemies in terms of goals in the conflict. Israel's goals have been coexistence and equality with other Arab states. There are 21 Arab states, and equal treatment of its own Arab citizens. And Israel has repeatedly been willing to accept a Palestinian Arab state as part of its peaceful coexistence with its Arab neighbors. Israel's enemies, by contrast, have sought to destroy Israel as a state and to kill and expel Israel's Jewish population. Although there has been some progress on this over time, now we have 6 of 21 Arab states that have been willing to sign peace agreements recognizing Israel's right to exist. What about methods? Let's start out with Israel's methods. So Israel has responded to conventional attacks and threats with conventional military responses designed to protect herself. Israel has responded to low-intensity warfare attacks on both military and civilian targets, guerrilla warfare, and terrorism, with discriminating responses. And no state has made a greater effort to limit civilian harm in these types of conflict than Israel has. During the 48 war, Israel's first war, which was the most dangerous war launched against her by her enemies, in which there was a significant threat that she would be destroyed in the cradle, Israel expelled Palestinian Arabs from 2 towns and a number of villages. Now, this does not account for the overwhelming majority of Palestinian refugees in the war. The overwhelming majority basically just fled the fighting, as is common in these wars. But in these limited number of cases in a few towns and villages, Israel made the decision to expel the Arab populations because fighters were living amongst these populations. The populations were present in important lines of communication, and Israel was desperately fighting for her existence under conditions where she did not have a military large enough to be able to garrison these towns and villages. Since 1967, Israel has sponsored Jewish settlement in the West Bank and Gaza, mostly concentrated on Jerusalem's periphery. The intention behind this was to solidify claims to territory that Israel considered to be necessary for her existence. And this is in contrast to what most other states do in this types of situation, where they not only move their own people into disputed territories, but they expel or kill enemy populations in disputed territory. So Israel has not done this in the settlements since 1967. In the Oslo peace process since 1993, Israel turned over almost all of Gaza and the major West Bank population centers to the PLO-controlled Palestinian Authority, creating a de facto Palestinian state pending a final peace agreement. The PLO was unwilling to accept such peace offers and instead returned to war. So in 2005, the Israeli government made the decision to withdraw completely from Gaza and a small number of West Bank settlements as part of an effort to separate Israel's population from the Palestinian population, basically awaiting a time until there were Palestinian leaders willing to sign a peace agreement between the de facto Palestinian state and Israel. What about the methods of Israel's enemies, the Palestinian Arabs, the other Arab states, and Iran and Hezbollah? These enemies have initiated or threatened multiple conventional wars of annihilation. They've maintained a nearly constant low-intensity warfare against both military and civilian targets. They've used force against their own populations and against each other to prevent moderate elements from attempting or possibly attempting to make peace with Israel. When they have overrun Jewish populated areas in 1948, or most recently this last year, they have killed or expelled Jewish civilians. Where they've had the capability, they have not just engaged in low-intensity attacks on Jewish civilians, but they have escalated to massacre and large-scale bombardment of civilian population centers. They also persecuted the Jewish populations within their territories, leading almost all of them to flee, mostly to Israel. And some of these enemies, of course, most importantly now, including Iran, have sought nuclear weapons while calling for Israel's destruction. Okay, I'm just going to stop for a minute here and talk for a moment about the most recent conflict. Israel has received tremendous international criticism for the way in which it has fought its counteroffensive against the October 7th attacks. So what can we say about this? Hamas intentionally built its civilian capabilities around its civilian population, making it impossible for Israel to fight it without civilians being in the way. Nevertheless, Israel has taken far-reaching steps to minimize civilian casualties. This includes advance warning of where Israeli offensives would be, strict rules of engagement and surveillance and oversight of its troops, such that they are required to act in accordance with these rules of engagement, evacuation corridors and combat pauses to allow civilians to flee to designated areas where there is not warfare going on. These measures are similar to or more far-reaching than those of other moderate states, such as the United States or United Kingdom, in the similar conflicts that they engaged in Iraq and Afghanistan. In this fighting, unfortunately, there have been significant civilian casualties, but the ratio of civilians to combatants killed in the fighting appears to be 2-to-1 or lower. This is similar to or better than the ratios achieved by the US in similar fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq, and it is far better than what Israel's enemies have achieved in fighting in similar conflicts. So Israel is among the best, again, of all states in minimizing civilian casualties in this type of fighting. Nevertheless, it is only Israel which is subjected to far-reaching criticism under these conditions, demanding an immediate ceasefire before she could respond. That's denying a right to self-defense. And when she did act, accusing her completely falsely of genocide. Okay, what about the threat levels faced by the two sides? Israel has faced repeated, nearly constant threats of annihilation, not just of the state, but of its Jewish population, by a variety of means, by conventional invasion, by bombardment of civilian population centers, and potentially by acquisition of nuclear weapons. Israel's enemies, by contrast, have faced far more limited threats: retaliatory military casualties in response to their attacks, losses of border territories. These losses have been limited by the norms that Israel imposes on herself, the norms of restraint, as well as significant outside pressure on Israel by the United States and other great powers. Before 1967, the West Bank and Gaza, of course, were controlled by Jordan and Egypt. They were not controlled by Israel. When these territories were lost to Israel in 1967, since that time, it would have been possible at a variety of times, almost at any time, to recover almost all of these territories by agreeing to peace negotiations and coming to some sort of a peace agreement with Israel. This possibility has actually been implemented since the Oslo process in 1993, when a de facto Palestinian state was formed under the control of the PLO. Since 2007, of course, a second de facto Palestinian state was created in Gaza under Hamas. And of course, we should keep in mind here that Palestinian Arabs are part of the larger Arab world. There are 21 Arab states, leaving aside the Palestinians. Of those, one of them, Jordan, has a majority Palestinian Arab population. Okay, so to summarize, how does Israel compare to her enemies? So Israel's moderation in her goals and methods and the far-reaching lethal threat that she potentially faces contrast very strongly with the extremism of her enemies, the extreme goals and extreme methods used by her enemies and by the more limited threats they face. Among the many, many conflicts of this type across the world, more than 50 major conflicts of this type during World War II, there is no greater asymmetry or difference between the two sides than there is in this conflict. That is a case where you have one country or one side that is among the best and the other side that is among the worst. There is no greater difference than in this conflict. It is not fair or reasonable to judge Israel by using abstract or utopian standards that no country in the world in these types of conflicts meets. Rather, Israel should be judged by comparison, again, with other states involved in these conflicts. And when we compare Israel with other states, not just her enemies, but all other states involved in these types of conflicts, again, Israel is among the most moderate while facing by far the greatest threats. Almost all the other states involved in these types of conflicts pursue far more extreme goals and use far more extreme methods while facing far more limited threats. So what we're going to do now is compare Israel first to Turkey and then to a larger number of states of this type. Okay, so you can see here just on some maps the major conflicts of this type that Turkey has been involved in. First, on the left, we see the conflicts during and after World War I with Turkey's Armenian and Greek populations. Then we have the conflict mostly in 1974 with Cyprus, with the Greek Cypriots. And then since 1984, we have a major conflict with Turkey's Kurdish population, which lives in Turkey's southeastern region. So let's look at goals first. How does Turkey compare with her enemies in these conflicts? So Turkey's goals in the early conflicts during and after World War I were to expel and kill nearly the entire Armenian population and to expel nearly all the Greeks living in what is now Turkey. In the Cyprus conflict, to conquer the northern 36% of Cyprus and to expel all the Greek Cypriots from that part of the island. And before and during the conflict with the Kurds, to forcibly assimilate the Kurdish population, that is to destroy their separate identity and force them to adopt an ethnic Turkish identity. Turkey's enemies' goals. The Armenians and Greeks sought to secede from Turkish-controlled regions of what is now Turkey and set up their own states, or join, in the case of the Greeks, to join with the existing Greek state. This might have involved expulsions of Turks and Kurds from Armenian-populated areas and of Turks from Greek-populated areas. In the case of the Greek Cypriots, they were seeking majority rule by the Greeks in Cyprus, or union of Cyprus with Greece, under a status quo condition where the 18% Turkish population of Cyprus had equal power to the 80% plus population of Greeks. What about methods? For the Armenians, again, Turkey engaged in genocidal killings and forced expulsions of the entire Armenian population, forced expulsions and killings on a smaller scale of the Anatolian Greeks, of the Greeks in what is now Turkey. In the case of Cyprus, forced expulsion of the Greek Cypriots from northern Cyprus. In the case of the Kurds in Turkey, forced expulsion of Kurds from thousands of villages where rebels were present or were nearby. And in fighting those rebels, indiscriminate warfare, that is no attempt to separate civilians from combatants, and intentional targeting of civilian populations among the Kurdish civilian populations. And this war also extended across the border into Syria and Iraq, where there are also Kurdish populations and safe havens. And again, in fighting the Kurdish rebels in those regions, Turkey engaged in indiscriminate warfare, not attempting to limit civilian casualties. And in the Syrian civil war, terror and forced expulsions against the Kurdish population in border regions of Syria. What about the methods of Turkey's enemies? So conventional invasion by Greece of what is now Turkey to attempt to bring certain parts of that territory under its own control to create a larger Greek state. Some forced expulsions and civilian killings of Turks, but on a much smaller scale, less systematic scale than Turkey. The Armenians and Kurds engaged in low-intensity warfare against both military and civilian targets. And again, as I mentioned, the Greek Cypriots attempted to achieve Greek majority rule by overthrowing the existing government and attempting to unify it with Greece. Threat levels. Turkey was faced with loss of significant territories where there were Armenian and Greek populations. In the case of the Turkish Cypriots in Cyprus, they were faced with a loss of their veto power over all major legislation and decision-making in Cyprus, which they had had since independence. And they faced integration into potentially a Greek majority state, possibly integrated with Greece. All of these populations faced direct threats from Turkey. So they faced much larger threats. The Armenians faced annihilation, as we discussed, and the Anatolian Greeks and the Greek Cypriots in northern Cyprus faced expulsion. The Kurds have been expelled from large regions where rebels were active, and throughout have been exposed to forced assimilation policies in education and culture. And again, during the Syrian civil war, there were large-scale expulsions from border regions. So if we compare Israel to Turkey, to summarize, Turkey faced more moderate enemies, both in terms of goals and methods, and more limited threats, and has been far more uncompromising, extreme in her own goals and methods as compared to her enemies. Yet few are aware of anything other than the Armenian genocide. The criticism or attempt to rectify the Armenian genocide has been limited to just trying to make Turkey to get Turkey to even admit that it committed a genocide. And international support for the Greek Cypriots and the Kurds is close to zero. So Turkish extremism is almost entirely ignored, and certainly no one denies Turkey's right to exist as they deny Israel's right to exist. Now, let me broaden this comparison now. So the type of comparison that I made just now between Israel and Turkey can be made with dozens of other countries involved in conflicts of this type. I will just briefly mention some of these. So first, we have the two great powers of Eurasia, Russia and China. So China has major conflicts of this type with the Tibetans and with the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang region. Russia has major conflicts of this type, of course, now with Ukraine, and before that with the Chechens in the Chechnya region of Russia. And we can also say that these types of conflicts are endemic or nearly constant across almost all of Asia. And there is a continuous belt of such conflicts running all the way from Turkey, all the way to Indonesia, through Iran, Iraq, in the Middle East, through Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh in South Asia, and through Burma, Thailand, the Philippines, and Indonesia in Southeast Asia. And in none of these cases do the countries come close to being both as moderate and facing the types of threats that Israel faces. There are similar types of conflicts in Europe. These have been more intense in previous decades. So we have the Yugoslav conflicts involving Croatia, Bosnia, and Serbia. And of course, we have the long-running conflict of the United Kingdom in Northern Ireland. Just some of the more major conflicts of the many that exist in Africa exist in Morocco, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Nigeria. And Israel's harshest enemies and critics have some of the worst records. So those that attack Israel most fiercely are among the worst by comparison with other states. And I'll just mention among that group China, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. Among countries involved in these conflicts are many democracies. In the case of the US here, I'm talking about its involvement in the Korean War. In the case of the UK and Northern Ireland. And then I mentioned the other countries already. So these are all democracies or were democracies at various times during their conflicts. None of them is clearly superior to Israel. At best, they are similar to Israel in their level of moderation, and none of them faces the kind of existential threats that Israel faces and faced. Now, who knows or cares about the conflicts in any of these other states, and who seeks to destroy them in the way that is the case for Israel? That is the double standard that we observe. So let me repeat the main conclusions. We can compare Israel to her enemies, and we can compare Israel to other countries involved in similar conflicts. And in both of these comparisons, Israel comes out very well among the best. So Israel's moderate goals and methods and the lethal threat that she faces contrast strongly with her enemies. The extremism of the goals and methods used by her enemies, the more limited threats that they face. Again, there is no conflict among the dozens of such conflicts where there is a bigger difference or asymmetry between the two sides. Israel, in being judged, should be compared to her enemies and to all other states involved in such conflicts. And when we make that comparison, no other state shows comparable moderation while facing a comparable threat. Yet, Israel is singled out among all other states, including many democratic ones, for the most extreme criticism. So this satisfies the IHRA definition of a hostile double standard. Now, this also involves an effort to not just deny Israel's right to self-determination, but to destroy Israel. So Israel's enemies unreasonably attack almost all of Israel's efforts at self-defense, as we see in the most recent conflict with Hamas. What is their goal in doing that? They seek to impose sanctions, economic sanctions, sanctions on military hardware that will weaken Israel by destroying her economy or undermining her economy and her ability to defend herself. They join the effort of Israel's enemies to destroy her and to destroy her Jewish population. No other state or people is targeted in such a biased way, despite its moderation compared to other states. Why is that? Because no other state and people has such extreme and dangerous enemies. And those who criticize Israel in this way, again, are joining the effort of these enemies. So let me conclude on a note of optimism. So Israel faces many threats and has faced these threats constantly since her origins, since she came into existence and even before she came into existence. Military threats, economic threats, demographic threats, that is the need to maintain a large majority Jewish population in Israel, diplomatic threats and ideological threats, diplomatic threats, coalitions of enemies that attempt to use sanctions to attack Israel and to undermine Israel, and a larger ideological war fought by these states and by civil society organizations against Israel. Israel has done tremendously well in surviving and in building her strength against this many-sided threat. And so we should take tremendous heart at the amazing accomplishments that Israel has achieved in this way and in the positive trends which we see in these areas. Now, still, there are two very dangerous threats among these five that Israel faces. One is a military threat. Above all, the nuclear threat should Iran acquire nuclear weapons, and the combined ideological and diplomatic threat to delegitimize, destroy Israel's reputation, and thereby make it easy to impose sanctions that will significantly weaken Israel. So the latter threat is the area where Israel supporters can have the biggest impact, and we all can take part. We all have an obligation to take part in this, given how deserving Israel is of our support. We need to do that, first of all, by taking action ourselves. That means educating ourselves, educating all those around us to the best of our ability, and joining, supporting both financially and with our labor, one or the other or both, one or more of the many organizations doing outstanding work in this area. There are so many, and we can achieve significant progress, and we can feel significant satisfaction in fighting the good fight among these organizations. Again, Israel's record compared to all other states involved in similar conflicts is an unparalleled record of moderation under existential threat. This gives a powerful factual and moral justification for outsiders to support Israel. Part of the appeal to these outsiders is also to show Israel's enemies for what they are, the worst, most lethal kinds of anti-Semites that seek to destroy Israel and her Jewish population, and also extremists who are part of larger coalitions around the world that threaten the rest of the world with the same kinds of extremism that Israel is threatened with. And here I'm speaking of the radical left and Islamic extremism. These are the two most important radical ideological forces around the world, and they probably target Israel most fiercely, of all enemies in the world, but they target most of the rest of the world as well. So Israel's enemies are the enemies of the rest of the world. And if the rest of the world becomes more informed of Israel and how it fights as compared to its enemies and as compared to other countries, then they will support Israel and they will join the effort to defend Israel. So thank you very much, and I look forward to discussing this issue with you.
So at this time, hi. So this time we're going to turn to questions and answers. Again, if you'd like to ask a question, please look at the Q&A box at the bottom, click on there, and you can put your question in. I'm going to start out with a question. The conflict seems to be religious, with Islam against Western civilization rather than just territorial. What are your thoughts on this?
Yes, thank you for that question. So I think the important point here is to distinguish between radical Islam and moderate Islam. Okay, so radical Islam is characterized by an ideology which we often call Islamism, or more loosely, we call it Islamic extremism. The goal is to impose what's considered a perfect form of Islamic law on societies that you rule over, and to expand the realm of rule of Islamic law to cover the entire world. Okay, so those are the goals of Hamas, of the Muslim Brotherhood, of Al Qaeda, of the Islamic State, although they use different methods to achieve those goals. So there is indeed a war between those groups, between radical Islam and the rest of the world, including even the tactical allies of radical Islam, such as the radical left, or such as countries like China. Of course, in the end, they have to come for each other. But in the meantime, they're fighting a common enemy. On the other hand, we know that Islam has moderate forms, and that many ordinary Muslims, perhaps most ordinary Muslims, or the overwhelming majority of ordinary Muslims, we have to try to understand this and to reach out to this community as much as possible. They are capable and willing to make peace, and we have to seek compromise with them as part of an effort to achieve peace in the long run.
So kind of relating to what you just said, um, and looking at the conflict and where Israel stands in it, do you think there are any other possible reasons for how Israel is judged besides anti-Semitism?
Yes, there are other reasons. So if we look at Israel's enemies, especially her near enemies in the Middle East and in many parts of the Muslim world, so attacking Israel is just a form of political scapegoating. So it's the same type of calculation that Tsarist Russia used in scapegoating Jews. In other words, you divert attention from your misrule, your repression, your corruption by diverting your population's attention to a demonic external enemy that you constantly attack. So that is an important motive also for many of Israel's enemies in the region. In the case of the far left, the hostility to Israel goes back to the Soviet hostility to Israel, which was ramped up in its international propaganda since the 1960s. And it attempted again to scapegoat Israel and to reach out ideologically to a larger audience for its own ideology by claiming that Israel was irredeemably evil and that Israel was in fact like Nazi Germany. And all the attacks that we see by the radical left now have been adopted wholesale from Soviet propaganda of that era, right? The idea that Israel is racist, is apartheid, is Nazi, that Israel is engaged in genocide. This is all part of an ideological effort to demonize Israel. Now, I think many people that repeat these talking points are not aware of how completely false they are, and of how they are more accurately actually applied to Israel's enemies, to the extent that they can be accurately applied to anyone. But many people believe this propaganda. You know, the old expression, by the time the truth gets its boots on, the lie has circulated around the world many times. This is an even bigger problem in our own age, where people are in these social media bubbles where they do not hear other points of view.
So there's a question that relates to that, which is why shouldn't well, first of all, how do we respond to those who believe the worst propaganda about Israel since the war with Hamas started? Because that kind of relates directly to what you were saying. How do we respond to that?
So we respond to it in two ways. The first way, which is more common and difficult because it takes more time and information to accomplish, is simply to rebut the lies and to say that Israel is not among the worst, Israel is among the best, and to patiently explain why that is the case, as we have to do now in the case of the war with Hamas. But another just as important thing, which is necessary, is to attack Israel's enemies for what they are. That is, we need to go on the counteroffensive. We need to say not just that Israel is not evil, but we need to say that most of Israel's enemies are evil. They're the ones who are the extremists. They're the ones that seek to exterminate Israel and impose their ideologies on the rest of the world. And that is something that can be conveyed in a simpler way, in a more intuitive way. And many people instinctively understand that. So that has to be part of it. Both of those responses are necessary.
Thank you. And what should Israel do to revive hopes for peace in this situation?
The answer to that is that there is no magic bullet. Okay, so peace cannot be achieved by wishing for it or by taking unilateral actions that ignore the nature of your enemies. If you ignore the nature of your enemies and you unilaterally take measures that weaken you, then you will get more wars and more attacks like the one on October 7th. So Israel needs to be patient, and her supporters need to be patient. That is, Israel remains open to making peace with any parties that genuinely want to make peace on reasonable terms, such as was occurring with the Abraham Accords before the October 7th attacks. On the other hand, while Israel can defeat enemies like Hamas, Israel does not have the ability to unilaterally change enemies like Iran or Hezbollah or the more radical elements among the Palestinians, and must simply wait for a time when it has such partners. It has only limited ability to try to strengthen such partners. So patience is necessary and waiting for opportunities to make peace, but it's not going to happen all at once. That's a utopian dream.
As you were saying that, a question came in that relates. How could you make progress with moderate Muslims in the Middle East when interaction with Jews is a threat to their lives from their own corrupt leaders?
It's a very difficult problem. And the answer is you cannot easily do that. So you can do that to a certain extent because many of these people do have access to the internet and social media in varying degrees. But it's very difficult for them to break out of the bubbles that their own governments and local radicalized populations have created. So it's a very difficult task. It's a long-term task. In many cases, it will not make significant progress, or it cannot make significant progress until the nature of the governments changes. But when they do change, then significant opportunities develop, as they have recently with many of the Abraham Accord countries.
That's an excellent answer. Thank you. Here's another question that came in. What is your opinion regarding the fact that even moderate Muslims are creating severe conflicts in Europe? Muslims have been called incompatible with Western life and civilization.
Okay, well, I would just say we have to be specific about what terms we use when we say moderate Muslims. So the way I would use the term moderate Muslim in a place like Europe or anywhere else would just be a Muslim who observes their religion. And for them, that is completely consistent with living as an equal citizen and accepting the same values as their fellow citizens accept in that country. And they would view themselves as no different from their fellow citizens. So obviously, moderate Muslims like that exist in huge numbers around the world, including in Europe. And what I would define as an extremist Muslim would be a Muslim that wants to impose Sharia law on the states that they live in, regardless of what the wishes are of the rest of the population, including moderate Muslims among the rest of the population. And obviously, Muslims with a more extreme ideology like that, they are a threat to the way of life of their communities and polities, but but we cannot include moderate Muslims defined in the way that I defined it amongst that group that is a threat.
Very interesting. And the next question I have for you, I think, has been on the minds of so many people. After October 7th, Israel had a lot of sympathy among the media. After all the past time, though, the media turned their backs against the Israeli population, and the media seems very sympathetic towards Palestinians and tries to show Israelis as an invader. Um, this is more of a statement than a question, but I guess what is your feeling about this? This person says the media is represented by anti-Israel sympathizers. And I know there is a lot of commenting that you might want to make on this.
Yes, it's a very important question. So first of all, let me go back and talk about the fact that certainly since the 1960s in the West, among the mainstream media and in places like universities, we've seen a rising tide of hostility to Israel. And I would say that this is as a result of the increased influence of far left ideologies, including the Soviet originated anti-Israel ideology, which we've already talked about. And because that ideology has become so omnipresent, many in the mainstream media that are not radical leftists themselves have absorbed it and have internalized that viewpoint, even though they don't take such a radical position themselves as outright supporting the destruction of Israel. Nevertheless, they view Israel as the villain, and they seek to deny Israel the right to defend herself in ways that are legitimate. So I would say that the so-called greater sympathy that occurred after October 7th among most of this group was through gritted teeth. It wasn't real sympathy. It was a grudging sympathy based on an inability to deny what happened. So as soon as the opportunity developed as a result of Israel's counteroffensive against Hamas to brand Israel as illegitimate and to attack Israel in a variety of ways, most of these people defaulted to their pre-existing ideology. And I would say in general that it is extremely difficult for people to change their ideologies, to admit that they were wrong. Events like October 7th are unlikely to change deep-rooted ideologies. So these people that in the media that attack Israel in this way are not people that can be easily convinced that Israel is more moderate than her enemies, that Israel acts far better than her enemies, or than almost all other countries involved in this conflict. We need to go after different audiences, people that are not as well informed, and people that have comparable ideologies, but seek to learn more about this conflict. This is where there's going to be the greatest success. And this is where there has been significant success. I should just mention that in this conflict, there's been a lot more friendly coverage of Israel, for example, in Western Europe than we saw in earlier conflicts. Why? It's because the eyes of many people in Western Europe have been opened up, and they've seen that Israel's enemies are their enemies to a large extent. And so they are more likely to sympathize with Israel. And so that group, for example, is a group that we can reach out to and that can become more and more favorably disposed toward Israel.
That's a really good light. The next question relates to this. We're all really aware of what's going on in college campuses, and this person asks, how can we get this information out to our young people, especially in our universities?
Yes, a very important question. And the problem we face here is the same problem as with the media, only bigger. Okay, so the radical left is far more entrenched and dominant in universities than it is in the mass media. So this element is far more hostile and will not change their point of view toward Israel. So the question is, how do we struggle or fight against this group on the ideological front? And the answer is there are many fine student organizations that seek to join this fight to defend Israel ideologically. In the You can find these on the internet, also in the booklet that's produced by Chaim Mitzvah that goes along with this lecture. There are a list of organizations at the end. There are many fine organizations that we can contribute to, that we can support, both financially and by our volunteering. And that is the most promising method.
And related to this, someone just typed in, is the speaker able to make this kind of speech on the college campus?
Yes, absolutely. I try to make speeches of this type whenever I can, to whomever I can. And like I said, I feel like this is my duty. This is all of our duty, wherever and whenever we can.
Thank you so much. Do you have any thoughts that you want to finish up with? There is one more question here, which I think might be helpful to kind of sum us up together. Why shouldn't Israel be held to a higher standard than other countries? Aren't most of these countries rogue states?
Very good question. Okay, the answer to that is that the IHRA definition that we're talking about says that it's most reasonable to compare Israel to other democracies. So we should hold democracies to higher standards than authoritarian regimes, and it is reasonable to do that. And using that standard, which is a reasonable standard, Israel, again, is among the best, most moderate of all states involved in such conflicts while facing the most lethal threats. On the other hand, using such standards should not stop us from pointing to the vicious behavior of Israel's enemies and many other extremist states in conflicts of this type. It is not an excuse that you are a rogue state. So it is very important to continue to attack Israel's enemies, to point out who they are. And the first point that you mentioned, so what I would like to say to people is, take heart, the truth and morality are on our side. Israel is among the best of all states involved in these conflicts. Israel is among the most deserving of our support, and Israel's enemies among the least deserving of our support. And we should be informed by that viewpoint in withstanding the barrage of genocidal propaganda that we're confronted with, and in fighting back against it.
Thank you so much. I feel like you've helped with tools that many of us can take back to the places we need to spread them. If you look on the Chaim Mitzvah website, you can find Dr. Shale Horowitz's contact info. So if you do want him to come speak or any other follow-ups, you're certainly welcome to email him. Professor Shale Horowitz's email will also be in our follow-up email. There'll also be a recording and a resource sheet, links to that for you if you need them. And I want to really thank you, Dr. Horowitz, for your insightful presentation. And thank everybody for joining us. Our next Scholars Circle lecture features Dr. Andrew Pessin, Professor of Philosophy and Jewish Studies at Connecticut College and Campus Bureau Editor of the Allgemeiner. Dr. Pessin will be presenting how campuses turned against the Jews on Monday, February 12th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So thanks again, everyone. Thanks again, Dr. Horowitz. And I'm sure all of us found this to be a really enlightening and helpful talk. And I know that I feel inspired from listening to you. So thank you very much.